Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of Oval Par Talk, a series of interviews which the Oval Observer Foundation conducts with the foremost experts on thematic areas ranging from security, sustainability, energy, public policy and foreign policy. Our guest for today is Mr. Vaheguru Pal Singh Sidhu. Mr. WPS Sidhu is the Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy with the Brookings India Center. He is also a Senior Fellow at New York University's Center on International Cooperation. He's been associated in various capacities with a range of institutions such as the East-West Institute, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, the International Peace Academy and the University of Oxford Center for International Studies. Mr. Sidhu is also a guest lecturer at the NATO Defense College in Rome and has written extensively for Mint newspaper on international and strategic issues. Thank you for being with us here today, Mr. Sidhu. I'm going to jump in straight ahead into one of the more hot topic issues for Indian foreign policy, particularly our relations with Pakistan. In August of this year, the Indian government suspended Foreign Secretary level talks with Pakistan after a meeting between the Pakistani High Commissioner Abdul Basit with some of the leaders of the Harriet movement in Kashmir. The message from the Indian establishment quite simply seemed to be talk to us or talk to the separatists, you can't have both. However, a number of experts have pointed out that consultations between separatist leaders and members of the Pakistani foreign policy establishment is not something new. In fact, many different Indian governments from different ends of the political spectrum have accepted in the past. Even a month ago, on July 19th, the Indian government didn't raise any objections to Harriet leaders meeting with the Pakistani High Commissioner. And secondly, many people feel that the strategy to hold talks hostage to commitments by Pakistan on cross-border security issues is something which has been tried in the past and which hasn't yielded any results over the last few years. Talks have been suspended 2 or 3 times in the last 4 or 5 years by both the UPA and the NDA governments of the past. So in this regard, do you feel that the suspension of talks, the decision that was taken by this government was justified? Do you think that it is a productive policy? And what are the implications as such for the future of the peace talks and the relations between the two neighbors?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And I think just to try and understand where this government is coming from and how it sort of approached this issue, I think you saw in May this very unprecedented invitation to have people, all the leaders from the SAARC countries come to the inauguration, swearing in, if you like, of Prime Minister Modi. And of course, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, was also one of them, and that was a good, useful start. But I think there's perhaps misperception on both sides as to whether this was going to be business as usual, which seems to be the perspective in Islamabad. Hence that meeting in July with the Hurriyat leaders. But then it sustained even after the Indian Foreign Secretary very categorically called in the High Commissioner of Pakistan to say, look, this is not on. And yet, so there was a sense of, that a lack of recognition in Islamabad that you now had a new regime in New Delhi and the way of doing business was different than in the past, even a break from the previous, if you like, NDA government. That being said, I think there's perhaps a more pragmatic reason why the government probably did not go ahead with the talks. Perhaps there's a recognition that this Pakistan government, although democratically elected, is not in a position to deliver. If you look at the kind of hoops that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had to jump through just to attend the swearing in, the sense was, what would he have to do to actually make these talks worthwhile, going forward? And so I think there's partly that recognition that maybe Pakistan is not in a position to deliver, even if these talks are going ahead. And as you know, this government has at least 2 priorities. The first is economic growth, and basically building up. And the second is a no-war scenario in the immediate neighborhood. Pakistan falls into the second category, not the first. And hence, I think there's perhaps a greater priority on wanting to link up with those countries which can provide capital for infrastructure, investments, etc., etc. Pakistan doesn't fall into that category. And there's also a concern that Pakistan may not be able to deliver on some of those kind of issues going forward. All of that being said, I personally think, you need to talk to those countries with whom you have fundamental issues. That's the core of diplomacy. And without that, it doesn't really move forward. Yes, we know in diplomacy we talk about preconditions, but you could actually have had talks about possible talks without actually having talks. But even that was a missed opportunity, in my opinion.
It's interesting that you touched upon the fact that we understand that the new regime in India wanted to set a new framework and new red lines, so to speak, that they didn't expect Pakistan to cross. But you said that there was a feeling among the establishment that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was not in a position to deliver. And I'm assuming that you're alluding to the fact that he's under a lot of domestic compulsions and constraints, given the delicate civilian-military balance in Pakistan. My question to you is quite simply that at that time, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was under a lot of pressure given the GeoTV incident which happened, which the TV station blamed the ISI for the murder of a journalist. You had domestic protests led by Imran Khan against the civilian government, and there was a lot of pushback from the military for Nawaz Sharif even attending the invitation that Prime Minister Modi sent out to him. And as such, is it not further strengthening the hand of the military in Pakistan by suspending talks with the civilian government, whereas continuing talks with the civilian government and hopefully going forward in a constructive atmosphere would have strengthened the hand of the civilian government versus the military government?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think one school of thought has been that India should have reached out because it would have strengthened Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's hand in domestically, but it's not that clear that that was in fact have happened, right? Because it's also quite possible that the same opposition, and I'm not even talking about the army at the moment, may actually have used that to say that he was actually negotiating from a position of weakness. So it's not quite clear that that alone would have been able to, strengthen his hand. Now, unless India offered very substantive, significant concessions, which frankly I think India perhaps could do in some areas, that may have gone forward, and especially if it could have a direct impact for the positive on Pakistan's economy, I think that would have made a difference. But I don't know whether there are steps that India can take to actually make that happen in Pakistan's economy.
Okay, fair enough. Just wanted to touch upon another point that you made when you said that one of Prime Minister Modi's two priorities, of course, is to make sure that there's a no-war atmosphere in the South Asian neighborhood, which is a prerequisite for Indian stability and Indian growth. Defense Minister Parekar recently made a statement which was taken up fairly controversially in Pakistan and which prompted a strong response from the Pakistani side, where he said, "I feel that there has to be some strong response which will once and for all reduce these blatant attempts. You will see the developments in the next 6 months. We have to ultimately teach those who are rogue a proper lesson. The nuclear doctrine asks us to maintain restraint. I am not talking of a full-scale war. Full-scale war is totally different." This was in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in the Kashmir region and the Uri sector.
Right.
And do you think that provocative statements made on both sides of the border by people in the establishment serve that agenda of a no-war atmosphere?
Right. And here again, I think, we all tend to look at this only in the India-Pakistan context, which, is understandable. But I think we need to widen the discourse a little bit further. So, yes, of course, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, but that did not prevent the United States from launching drone attacks in Pakistan. In fact, carrying out a very blatant military raid, which took out Osama bin Laden. The response of Pakistan was a lot of anger and annoyance, but really it was not a military response. And at no stage were nuclear weapons ever brandished. Now, clearly, India is not the United States, right? But I suspect that, there would be a fair amount of restraint that Pakistan would be forced into to escalate, especially if you have a very clearly proven trans-border incident which begins in Pakistan. And it's not only India which is going to, be concerned about the tactical nukes. It's also going to be the United States, and I would actually go to the extent of saying even China. Because clearly, there is a growing recognition and frustration in both these powers, one of them, by the way, a very close ally of Pakistan, that Pakistan has perhaps not done enough to manage the rogue elements within the state. So I think certainly Pakistan, may be tempted to escalate because this is India, but that's precisely the point. It's not just India that we're talking about here. The US is an actor, and so is China. And I think both of them, have recognized that no country can have a carte blanche to use the nuclear umbrella to carry out subconventional attacks.
It's a really interesting point that you bring out that when Pakistan decides to respond to any Indian response, the factors in its calculation will not be limited to India, but will take into account the larger international community, especially the big powers around it. But you also used the Abbottabad raid as an example of Pakistan exercising restraint in the face of a violation of its sovereignty. And Pakistan not playing the nuclear card. But is that a fair example, given that there is significant evidence to suggest that a lot of US activity is carried out on Pakistani soil with tacit collusion of Pakistani authorities or knowledge of Pakistani authorities, and secondly that Pakistan simply doesn't possess the missile resources to even think of striking US targets with a nuclear attack?
Well, the US forces are right there, so or even in Afghanistan. So in some ways, the US was clearly a target. But you raised the Abbottabad raid issue, and I think that really underlines precisely what you're saying, that was one raid where the US definitely did not inform Pakistan. And we also know that there have been some other incidences where the US certainly did not inform Pakistan. You're right, there are many other drone attacks which was carried out with the, if you like, in coordination or in cooperation with Pakistan. That's absolutely true. And it is possible, perhaps, to think of the Indian establishment being able to talk to the Pakistani establishment to carry out similar joint raids against the rogue elements. But one fundamental dimension there is that the Pakistan establishment, and here I include the military, should be ready to recognize that the rogues are part of the problem and challenge for them as well, and to coordinate simply the way that they've done with the United States as well. So to sort of say, and I make this point, I think, of course, Pakistan, India is not the same as the United States. But nonetheless, I think you can see parallels in that kind of a dimension.
Just to hark back to a point we were addressing earlier as well, given that we are discussing Pakistani responses and the nuclear doctrine, you're an expert on deterrence theory, and you have written and spoken extensively about the Indian nuclear doctrine, something that became a bit of a controversial issue in the run-up to the elections when the BJP manifesto addressed a need to review it. Right. Despite, of course, Prime Minister Modi explicitly saying that the no first use policy would not be changed. He called it a part of India's culture and heritage. Your thoughts on the need to review or to modify the Indian nuclear doctrine in a modern world, with non-state actors, for example. Right.
So just in terms of the manifesto actually is very categorical. Nowhere does it mention a review of the no first use. It merely mentions review and update the doctrine. So I think it's very carefully worded. even for a manifesto, which is quite interesting, and there's no reference to no first use. The assumption was that that is one area that might change in the Indian sort of context, given that that was a very particular characteristic of an Indian nuclear doctrine. Now here it's very interesting, you know, the very countries which for the longest possible time discredited the no first use doctrine as nothing but a mere declaration were the ones who were then sort of lining up to say, no, no, you cannot actually renege from that, right? But so the first point, I think the manifesto very categorically says this is not, it's not about the no first use, it's to review and update the doctrine, right? It could have included the no first use, but that controversy has clearly been laid to rest. There have been any number of statements, including by Prime Minister Modi, to say that that is not on the cards, right? Then we come to the issue of reviewing and updating the doctrine. This is actually a very standard established practice, particularly among democracies. The United States, for example, in the term of every president, has the nuclear posture review, which is done, you know, it's an exercise and there's an external, it's mostly classified, but there is also a slightly more public articulation about that, where people sort of say, look, the scenario has changed, and this is how you may think about deploying or using nuclear weapons in your security calculation. The US is not the only country to do that. Every French president has categorically also made similar articulations about the French doctrine at Cherbourg. And it was a few years ago, President Mitterrand, President Chirac made, raised a little bit of a controversy where he talked about using the nuclear doctrine against non-state actors or to counter non-state actors. So if you look at the role of other democracies in trying to reevaluate or update, review and update the role of their nuclear doctrine, I think India is following good practice in that sense. The last time the doctrine was reviewed was, I believe, 10 years ago, 2003.
They came out with it in 2003.
That's right. And since then, there has not been a public review of that. My understanding is there has been some discussions internally about reviewing and updating the doctrine, right? But I think there are at least two fundamental reasons why the Indian doctrine needs to be reviewed. Whether it's updated or not is a different issue, but it certainly needs to be reviewed. One, as you mentioned in another context, is the presence now of tactical nuclear weapons on the subcontinent in the hands of Pakistan. How do you counter that? How do you counter that without sort of going to a whole nuclear escalation or even a full-fledged war, as the defense minister has said? And so you need to take that into account. Also in that context, how do you deal with transnational attacks, cross-border terrorist attacks under the umbrella of a nuclear weapon? Do you sit back and say we can do nothing? Do you let Mumbai's happen, or do you try to work out some kind of a response? So that's another element. Now, until now, India has very categorically stated it has a no first use doctrine, that its weapons are de-alerted, they're not on alert, and they're also demated. That is, the warheads are separate from the delivery systems, right? Now, a nuclear armed submarine puts a lot of that under pressure. Technically, you could still have a de-alert. Technically, you could also demate the warheads and the delivery systems, but it's not necessarily normally the case in a nuclear armed submarine. So you need to think a little bit about that as well. Is there going to be some delegation of power to the commander, and what kind of delegation of power, right? None of this, by the way, takes away from the no first use. In fact, a nuclear armed submarine is a classic second strike weapon. It's not normally seen to be a first strike weapon. So there may be other ways you need to think about how you're going to use these nuclear armed submarines. And that may also require a certain bit of review and update of the doctrine.
Just continuing on the same theme, I also wanted to ask you in terms of the nuclear doctrine. One of the pillars of the nuclear doctrine has always been the threat of massive retaliation should a first strike against India ever. In your opinion, is that a credible threat? Is it credible for India to threaten massive retaliation, which in effect would be total annihilation of another country, if there was, let's say, a low-yield tactical device which was used against India on a battlefield? Is that something which holds credibility? And if it doesn't, then does the doctrine fail in that respect?
Right.
And,
no, please go ahead.
And my second question also was, is there a need for greater transparency and openness regarding India's nuclear security doctrine, in particular operational details of India's nuclear arsenal and its command structure?
Right.
Because there is a fair degree of secrecy that surrounds it, and in most democracies, the move has always been towards greater openness and transparency, sharing information with citizens.
Except in the case of nuclear weapons.
Except in the case of nuclear weapons, but do you feel that one, there is an argument to be made for greater transparency, and two, do you think that the concept of massive retaliation holds credible deterrent effect?
Right.
In case
Right.
of low-yield tactical strikes?
Right. So there's two sort of perspectives there. One is that, we take this statement literally, although I don't think, I'm just trying to recall whether the 2003 doctrine actually talks about massive retaliation. I think it talks about responding, but I don't think it actually uses the term massive retaliation in that sense. That being said, it is true that, countries will have a particular public posture. But then sometimes the operational posture is very, very different from there. And scholars who've looked at the Indian doctrine and studied it in great detail have actually argued that the way the Indian doctrine is unfolded, it is not even clear that India may respond even to a nuclear attack. In fact, one perspective is that India may not respond even to a nuclear attack. So it remains to be seen. And I guess this brings me on to your second question about, transparency, particularly vis-a-vis nuclear doctrines. Now, if you look worldwide, there's always been two kinds of, very clear distinctions when in terms of the nuclear doctrines. One has been the very classified, almost secret, standard operating procedures, PSYOPs as they're called, basically kind of seeing how the nuclear weapons are to be deployed, where and how to be used, etc. That is never public. Even today, for example, the United States or France or the UK, even China and Russia, but let's talk about the democracies, will not share with you what is the deployment pattern, where the nuclear weapons are kept, and really, how they're going to be used. That remains, in the realm of being classified. And so from that point of view, and then of course you do have a more public debate on the role of nuclear weapons, what you could do with them, and how and whether it should be massive retaliation, flexible response. But these are broad doctrinal, sort of statements. They don't get into the operational dimension. And I think India is following that tradition. Could India do more in terms of articulating its nuclear doctrine publicly? Perhaps. But there's certainly an element of the nuclear doctrine which is never going to become public. And that actually serves not just India, but actually the cause of deterrence quite well. So even the United Kingdom, democratic country, its nuclear doctrine is a very simple one. It simply says in one line that the UK will use nuclear weapons when its security is threatened. It doesn't articulate more than that. So here, if a bastion of democracy and transparency is kind of, making a distinction between the public statement and the private, the operational part of it. I think that's what India is doing as well.
My initial question to you was specifically about the credibility of the massive retaliation concept.
Right.
And one of your responses, you stated that a lot of scholars have argued that even the concept of a retaliatory strike, forget about a massive retaliatory strike, is not deemed to be credible. By some authors, it has been questioned by many experts and scholars on the issue. And I think we'll both agree that credibility is the critical component of any deterrent, theory, right? And so if there is significant debate about whether or not India's commitment to even a retaliatory strike is credible or not, does that indicate a failure of articulating our nuclear doctrine successfully?
That's a fair point, but I think, again, I'd make a distinction between massive retaliation and some retaliation and no retaliation. My own sense is that I think there will be some retaliation. That's my own sense. But I don't think it's going to be either massive or no response. I think there will be a response, but it will be a very, for want of a better word, an Indian response. And what that is, I think, is going to be a work in progress. But we know the way the doctrine has evolved, there's very much been a sense of, look, India does not need to respond immediately, India can take its time, and you have seen that degree of restraint in conventional or sub-conventional issues. Any other country in the world would perhaps have responded to something like the Mumbai attack. India did not. So I think in a way, there's a great degree of restraint, but I think on the nuclear issue, it's certainly, moved to a certain direction precisely for the issue that you've said. You need to have a credible deterrence and a credible posture. And, it certainly questions credibility to say that you're not going to use them,
Just to move away a little bit, something that's been in the news very frequently, the Russian arms deal with Pakistan. And it's a major sort of shift in this strategic relations of Russia and Pakistan, where basically Russia approved the sale of the Mi-35 helicopters to Pakistan, but not just that, announced the signing of a major defense cooperation agreement, which would range from counter-terrorism to counter-narcotics to military naval exercises and drills. And the deal becomes even more significant given that it's been in the works for about 6-7 months, that India did have prior warning to it, that we did register our apprehension and our opposition to such a deal taking place. That
right.
Just 3 years ago, President Putin had stated that there will be no strategic relations with Pakistan because Russia values its Indian partners so much. Given that we had warning, given that we value relations with Russia so much, is this a failure of Indian diplomacy?
Well, I think I wouldn't necessarily categorize that as a failure of Indian democracy, of diplomacy rather. But really, I would say it's the new reality. The new reality is that Russia remains an important partner for India in defense issues, but not the only partner. And this is not the first time that we have seen India move outside of the Russian ambit. In the 1980s, you may recall, India went on a major buying spree of European weapons. Swedish artillery guns, German submarines, French aircraft, Italian torpedoes, British aircraft and aircraft carriers. So there has been a desire to diversify its capabilities. And I think that's fair. There are some areas where the Russian weapons are still very unique and will give India the technology that, actually not the technology, but the weapons that others are not willing to give. For example, a nuclear-powered submarine. No other country until now has been willing to give that to India. But on the other hand, I think India also needs to diversify and see where its options lie, what other alternatives are there, And to be fair, Russian equipment, with few exceptions, again, tends to be dated. The technology is not transferred, and there's also a reliability issue. So I think there are reasons and factors for India to look beyond Russia as well, and by that logic for Russia to look beyond India too. For example, now India is starting to look to the US for weapon systems or the Israelis for weapon systems, and both of those are again logical sort of steps in the in the Indian build-up, if you like. But my own sense is, I think Russia's outreach to Pakistan is in some ways both short-sighted, but also a little bit desperate. And I'll explain why. Because even if, let's start with the helicopters that you mentioned, even if those helicopters have been offered, right, how many helicopters do you think Pakistan may be in a position to buy?
I think the number that's been quoted in the media is around 12, just a dozen to start.
Precisely. So that's probably going to be 1/10 of the number of helicopters that a country like India might have bought if those helicopters met the standards, right? So for the sake of 12 helicopters, if Russia is willing to dramatically annoy, if you like, or irritate its biggest customer, that's not good business at all. So I think there's you want to make sure that your biggest customer and your potentially most loyal customer, even in the future, is going to be comfortable with that. Now, the argument that we heard from Russia was that the Mi-35 was offered to India, but India turned it down for the Apaches, the American Apache helicopters. That for me raises the question of saying, well, India is going to look for whatever is the best is available. And the Mi-35 was clearly not the best helicopter. Instead of coming back to India and sort of saying, look, can we actually make this helicopter better? How can we do that? Russia chooses to sell it to Pakistan, which is fine. They'll sell 12 helicopters, but that's not going to get them or Pakistan very far. On the other hand, you also heard this sort of joint exercises on narcotics in particular and counterterrorism. Certainly on counter-narcotics, the Russians do have a case because, the single largest country affected by narcotics coming out of Afghanistan has been Russia. There have been other European countries too, and perhaps Iran as well, but certainly Russia has been the biggest victim of that. And which is why they need to work closer with Afghanistan, with Iran, and with Pakistan. So I think that's a fairly, understandable sort of logic. Now, on counterterrorism, I think, I'm not sure how reliable a partner Pakistan is on counterterrorism. But if Russia feels that it is a reliable partner, then, so be it. That is their call. But we know, for example, if you look at the case of China, and particularly vis-a-vis the Xinjiang province, China has not been particularly comforted by the role of its closest ally. So I suspect, that the same might be the experience of Russia, but perhaps the Russians have no option. They need to deal with that on that particular front. And lastly, I think in terms of naval exercises, those have really become quite standard now. Almost every country in the world is exercising with the other. And, I think there are some areas where you can see it may make a lot of sense for Russia and Pakistan to do joint exercises, rescue at sea, counter piracy. This is of interest. So that could possibly happen. But I'm not sure that you're necessarily going to see a very dramatic shift or a pivot, if you like, on the part of Moscow to Islamabad. New Delhi remains very important, and Pakistan is relatively less of a weighty ally in that sense.
I understand the strategic insignificance, for lack of a better word, of 12 Mi-35 helicopters and the necessity of counter-narcotics and counter-piracy operations that Russia needs to conduct with Pakistani cooperation. But the signing of a defense cooperation agreement which opens up the door for further arms sales, which was embargoed by Russia de facto for the last 30 years. And in particular, the sudden convergence of Chinese, Pakistani and Russian interests in Afghanistan, like a common language that they claim that they can now speak on counterterrorism, whereas the language that Russia has so far spoken on counterterrorism has always been aligned with India's definition of counterterrorism, India's response to counterterrorism in the region. So is that convergence of Russian and Pakistani interests, or at least a hypothetical convergence sometime in the future, a cause for concern, especially as you said, that you think that Russia has been short-sighted in sweeping away Indian objections to this deal?
Right. So on the military cooperation, the Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of yesterday. It can no longer afford to give away weapons. It has, as I mentioned earlier, not been the most reliable supplier, which is why India has looked for alternatives. It has not transferred technology, and their equipment has also been, sometimes below par. With all of those caveats, if Pakistan is turning to them for weapons, on the one hand, it shows a certain degree of, I wouldn't necessarily say desperation on their part, but basically, that they're running out of options. And it's true, if you have an option between buying Chinese weapons and Russian ones, undoubtedly the Russian ones are better. But the question then comes, can Pakistan afford these weapons? Because they're not going to be given on a platter. The Chinese could afford to do that, and there were other strategic stakes there. Russia, cannot afford to do that. If Pakistan can pay for these weapons, all power to them. They should buy as many as they can. I don't think they have the capability and the capacity. And if they do, it may come at a very serious cost to them. On your other issue of the counterterrorism cooperation, yes, there I think, there's maybe a desire to look at how do you address the challenges that terrorism is kind of facing, is posing, both in Afghanistan but also to Pakistan, right? But in a way, I would actually probably see that as, to some degree, not necessarily an endorsement of Pakistan's counterterrorism capabilities, but its weakness. That these two countries actually feel that they need to engage very closely with Pakistan to see how they might be able to support some of the capabilities, to get into some of their, their rogue elements, perhaps. So I think that may be another dimension behind this approach, if you like.
Thank you so much. I don't think we're going to have the time for any more questions, but thank you so much for such an enlightening conversation and for agreeing to come here, and we hope to have you back again sometime soon.
Thanks very much. That was fun.